The yellow lights from downtown cafe pierced through the pre-dawn darkness, casting long shadows across the empty street. Melina's keys jingled as she unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of coffee beans and yesterday's pastries welcoming her home. At 35, she had spent more time in this cafe than in her own apartment, and every morning for the past 12 years began the same way. She flipped the switches, bringing the kitchen to life. The industrial coffee maker hummed as she started the first batch, her movements automatic as she pulled out mixing bowls for the morning's fresh bread. The aroma of yeast and flour filled the air as she kneaded the dough, her mind wandering to the dwindling number of customers they'd served last week. The cafe's ledger, worn and increasingly filled with red ink, sat accusingly on the counter. 7:30 came, and Melina began her favorite morning ritual. She walked to the corner table, Walter's table, wiping it down with extra care before placing the day's newspaper precisely in the center. The coffee cup, his special cup with the slightly chipped rim that he refused to let them replace, waited patiently for 8 o'clock. The morning regulars trickled in slowly. Mrs. Henderson with her Earl Grey and scone, the Martinez twins rushing in for their takeaway lattes, each greeting Melina with familiar smiles, but she couldn't help noticing the empty tables that used to be filled with the breakfast crowd. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. Walter Bucksword shuffled in, his weathered army jacket hanging loosely on his thin frame. "Morning's too damn bright," he grumbled, making his way to his corner table. "Good morning to you too, Walter," Melina smiled, already pouring his extra strong coffee. "The paper's waiting for you." "World's going to hell," Walter muttered, opening to the front page. "These politicians wouldn't know their rear end from their elbow." Another customer, sitting 2 tables over, snorted. "Maybe if you weren't stuck in the 1940s, old-timer dash." "Excuse me," Walter's voice carried the sharp edge of a combat veteran. "I fought so you could sit there and run your mouth." "Freshly baked cinnamon rolls," Melina announced loudly, stepping between the tables. "Walter, I saved you one with extra icing, just how you like it." She placed the warm pastry before him, touching his shoulder gently. The tension in his jaw eased slightly. "These young people," Walter grumbled, but his focus shifted to the cinnamon roll. "At least someone still knows how to do things right." From behind the counter, Mr. Carter, the cafe's owner, caught Melina's eye. He held up a stack of bills, his expression grim. Across the street, the new artisanal coffee shop's windows showed a packed house, young professionals lined up for their morning fix. Walter watched the interaction, his bushy eyebrows furrowed. He sipped his coffee slowly, observing as Melina moved between the mostly empty tables, maintaining her warm smile despite the obvious struggle. The morning stretched on, and Melina wiped down table after table, straightening chairs that hadn't been used. Through the window, she watched the steady stream of customers entering the modern establishments across the street, their sleek signs and minimalist decor drawing in the neighborhood's newer residents. When Walter finally stood to leave, he left his usual generous tip, far more than his coffee and cinnamon roll cost. Melina tried to protest, as she always did, but he waved her off. "You're the only one who gets it right," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. He paused at the door, turning back to look at the cafe with an expression Melina had never seen before. His eyes lingered on his corner table, then on her, as if trying to memorize every detail. The bell chimed one last time as he stepped out into the late morning sun, his silhouette growing smaller as he walked away. That would be the last time Melina would see Walter alive, though she didn't know it yet. The rest of the day dragged on with the familiar rhythm of clinking cups and quiet conversations. Melina found herself glancing at Walter's empty chair throughout her shift, his unusual goodbye playing over in her mind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his table, highlighting the fingerprints he'd left on his coffee cup. "You've got to stop babying him," Mr. Carter said as he counted the day's meager earnings. He's just one customer. Melina wiped down the counter, shaking her head. He's not just a customer. None of them are. That's what places across the street don't understand. The evening brought a small dinner crowd, mostly elderly regulars who'd been coming to Downtown Cafe since before Melina started working there. She served them with the same care she always did, remembering their preferences, asking about their grandchildren, listening to stories she'd heard a dozen times before. As she locked up that night, the streetlights flickering to life above her, Melina couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Walter's farewell felt like more than just a goodbye to another day. She tucked his special cup away in its designated spot, straightened his chair one last time, and turned off the lights. The cafe fell into darkness except for the neon open sign that had hung in the window since 1963. Across the street, the modern cafes were still bustling, the trendy music and laughter spilling onto the sidewalk. But in the quiet darkness of Downtown Cafe, the ghost of Walter's last look lingered, like a message she hadn't quite understood. Melina stood by the entrance of Downtown Cafe, her eyes fixed on the clock as it struck 8 a.m. The familiar silhouette of Walter Buckswords failed to appear for the 14th consecutive day. The morning light filtered through the cafe's windows, casting long shadows across the empty table in the corner. Walter's table. She wiped the already spotless surface of his regular spot, adjusting the newspaper that would remain unread. The ritual had become almost mechanical over the past 2 weeks, a hopeful gesture that somehow made his absence more pronounced. The regular customers, mostly elderly patrons who had been coming to the cafe for years, exchanged worried glances with Melina as they sipped their morning coffee. "Still no sign of old Buck?" asked Mr. Peterson, one of the regulars who often engaged in heated political debates with Walter. Melina shook her head, forcing a smile. "Not yet. I've been trying to find out where he might be." But her voice trailed off as she refilled Mr. Peterson's cup. During her break, Melina sat at the counter, phone in hand, methodically dialing the numbers of local hospitals. Each call ended the same way. No patient by that name, no information available. The growing knot in her stomach tightened with each passing hour. As she cleared tables that afternoon, she found an old napkin tucked between the salt and pepper shakers at Walter's table. His distinct handwriting caught her eye, a series of numbers and what appeared to be military coordinates. She carefully folded it and placed it in her apron pocket, another piece of the puzzle that was Walter Buckswords. The preliminary eviction notice arrived that morning, adding to her growing anxiety. The cafe's owner had left it on the counter without a word, the official letterhead stark against the worn formica surface. Melina tried to push it out of her mind, focusing instead on the mystery of Walter's disappearance. During a quiet moment, she picked up the local newspaper, scanning through the pages as she had done every day since Walter's disappearance. This time, her heart stopped as she reached the obituary section. There, in simple black and white, was Walter's name. The coffee pot she was holding nearly slipped from her grasp. Walter Buckswords, 89, decorated World War II veteran, passed away peacefully in his sleep. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. After closing time, Melina sat alone at Walter's table, the chair's familiar creak a painful reminder of his absence. The cafe felt eerily quiet without his grumbling about the day's headlines or his complaints about the modern world's shortcomings. The letter arrived the next morning. The formal envelope bore the letterhead of Preston and Associates, attorneys at law. Melina's hands trembled as she opened it, the thick paper feeling foreign between her fingers. The contents spoke of an urgent matter regarding inheritance and requested her presence at their downtown office. "An inheritance?" her coworker Maria asked, peering over her shoulder. "What would old Mr. Swords leave you?" Melina shared the news with her colleagues, their reactions ranging from surprise to curiosity. None of them had known much about Walter beyond his daily routine at the cafe, his generous tips, and his gruff demeanor. That evening, as she prepared to leave for the lawyer's office, Melina stood before Walter's empty table one last time. The setting sun cast long shadows across the worn surface, highlighting years of coffee rings and small scratches, each marking a moment in time, a conversation, a shared silence. She straightened her uniform, grabbed her purse, and took a deep breath. The weight of the napkin with Walter's handwriting seemed to grow heavier in her pocket as she walked toward the door. The bell above the entrance chimed one final time as she stepped out into the gathering dusk. The moment Melina opened the door to the law office, her life would change forever. The elevator ascent to the 12th floor felt eternal. The law firm's reception area was everything the cafe wasn't: sleek, modern, and impersonal. Crystal chandeliers cast pristine light across marble floors, a stark contrast to the warm, worn atmosphere of downtown cafe. Ms. Melina Santos? A polished receptionist gestured toward a set of heavy wooden doors. Mr. Preston will see you now. Inside the office, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city Walter had called home for decades. Mr. Preston, a distinguished man in his 60s, stood from behind his mahogany desk. "Please sit down, Miss Santos." He opened a leather portfolio. "I understand you were acquainted with Mr. Walter Buckswords?" Melina nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, he was a regular at the cafe. For 12 years. More than just a regular, it seems." Preston removed his glasses, studying her carefully. "Mr. Sword spoke of you often during our meetings. Quite fondly, I might add." He pulled out a thick envelope sealed with wax. "What I'm about to share with you may come as a shock. Mr. Swords was a very wealthy man, though he chose to live modestly. His estate is valued at approximately $8 million. Melina's breath caught in her throat. The Walter she knew complained about paying 50 cents more for his morning coffee when they'd raised prices last year. "And you, Miss Santos, are his sole heir." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and surreal. Through her shock, Melina barely registered Preston explaining the conditions of the inheritance. Something about maintaining the cafe, specific requirements that seemed to echo from a great distance. As reality slowly seeped back in, her thoughts drifted to Walter's empty table, to the napkin in her pocket, to 12 years of small kindnesses that had somehow led to this moment. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber that reminded her of coffee and morning light. The moment Melina opened the door to the law office, her life would change forever. Melina's heels clicked against the marble floor of Morrison & Associates' law office, her heart pounding as she made her way through the imposing lobby. The receptionist directed her to the 20th floor, where leather chairs and mahogany panels spoke of wealth she had only seen in movies. Mr. Morrison's office was even more impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown. The lawyer, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, gestured for her to sit down. "Miss Walker, thank you for coming," he began, pulling out a thick folder. "I understand you knew Mr. Walter Buckswords?" "Yes, he was a regular at the downtown cafe for years," Melina replied, smoothing her best skirt nervously. "What you might not have known is that Mr. Swords was a very wealthy man." Morrison opened the folder, revealing documents and photographs. "He lived modestly by choice, but his estate is valued at approximately $12 million. Melina's mouth went dry. She thought about Walter's worn jacket, his daily routine of black coffee and toast, his careful counting of change for tips. "Mr. Swords has named you as his sole heir." The words hung in the air like suspended particles of dust. Melina gripped the arms of her chair. Certainly she had misheard. "There must be some mistake," she managed to say. Morrison shook his head, sliding the will across his desk. "No mistake. However, there are conditions." He adjusted his glasses. "The cafe where you work. Mr. Sword specifically required that it remain operational for at least 1 year after his death." As Morrison explained the details, Melina's mind drifted to countless mornings of serving Walter his coffee, his gruff exterior hiding something she'd never fully understood until now. The first call came while she was still in the office, a woman identifying herself as Walter's niece, her voice sharp with accusation. Morrison handled it smoothly. but the tension lingered in the air. Later that day, Melina stood in Walter's modest house, surrounded by his belongings. Military medals hung in simple frames. A collection of photographs showed a younger Walter in uniform, standing proud among his fellow soldiers. In one corner, a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon caught her eye. She found herself drawn to his desk, where a leather-bound journal lay untouched. Opening it carefully, she discovered pages filled with neat handwriting, detailing thoughts and memories she never knew he carried. "The cafe is the only place where the noise in my head quiets down," one entry read. "That girl, Melina, she reminds me so much of Sarah." More calls came throughout the afternoon. Walter's family members, each more hostile than the last, demanding explanations, suggesting manipulation, threatening legal action. Morrison assured her they had no standing, but doubt began to creep in. In Walter's bedroom, Melina found a box of military memorabilia. Medals, patches, and photographs spilled out, telling the story of a war hero who never spoke of his achievements. Among them, she discovered a small notebook filled with observations about the cafe, about her, about the peace he found there. The day grew long as she pieced together the puzzle of Walter's life. His daughter Sarah, killed in a car accident 20 years ago. His wife's death shortly after. The solitude he chose, broken only by his daily visits to the cafe. Morrison called again, his voice grave. "The family is claiming he wasn't of sound mind when he made the will. They're saying he showed signs of early dementia." Melina sat heavily in Walter's old armchair, surrounded by the evidence of a life fully lived but carefully guarded. She thought about his sharp comments on current events, his detailed memories of the war, his subtle observations about the cafe's regular customers. As evening approached, she gathered some of the most important documents to take with her. The journal, the photographs, anything that might help understand why Walter had chosen her. As she was preparing to leave, she noticed something falling from between the journal's pages. An envelope marked "Confidential" slipped to the floor, its seal unbroken, its contents still guarding whatever secret Walter had deemed important enough to preserve but not to share. Melina stared at the envelope, its edges yellowed with age, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. A breeze from the open window carried the scent of approaching rain, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled. She reached for the envelope with trembling fingers, and as she broke the seal, she discovered secrets that no one was ever meant to find. The first page revealed a series of coordinates and dates, written in Walter's precise handwriting. Beneath them, a letter addressed to someone named Heinrich Muller, dated 1945. The pages that followed contained photographs she had never seen before. Walter with a group of men in civilian clothes, all looking tense and watchful. Notes in German filled the margins. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Morrison. "Family filing preliminary injunction tomorrow. Need to meet first thing." Melina carefully returned the documents to the envelope, her mind racing. Whatever these papers contained, they were clearly more than just war memorabilia. She thought about Walter's occasional nightmares he'd mentioned, the way he'd sometimes stare into space when aircraft flew overhead. In the kitchen, she found a metal box hidden behind loose wallpaper, containing more letters, these in code, and a small black notebook with names and dates. Everything seemed to point to operations that went far beyond what Walter had ever shared about his military service. The last light of day was fading when she finally locked up his house. She held the confidential envelope close, knowing that its contents might change everything. As she walked to her car, a dark sedan slowly drove past, and she caught sight of a woman who looked remarkably like the one in Walter's family photos. Thunder rolled in the distance as Melina started her car, the envelope heavy in her purse. Whatever secrets Walter had kept, whatever missions he had undertaken, they were now part of her inheritance, along with all the dangers they might bring. Melina's hands trembled as she opened the confidential envelope that had fallen from Walter's diary. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of his modest home, illuminating decades of memories preserved in photographs and letters. Before she could examine the contents, her phone buzzed with a notification. Another legal document from Walter's family had arrived. The lawsuit papers felt heavy in her hands, filled with accusations of manipulation and elder abuse. They claimed she had taken advantage of a vulnerable old man, painting a picture so different from the Walter, she knew that it made her stomach turn. The family's lawyers had constructed an elaborate narrative of a waitress who had schemed her way into a fortune. Later that afternoon, she faced Walter's relatives for the first time in the lawyer's office. His niece, Margaret, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, glared at her from across the conference table. "We all know what you did," Margaret spat. "Uncle Walter would never leave everything to a stranger. He was sick, confused." But among Walter's belongings, Melina had found something that told a different story. Hidden in an old shoebox, she discovered photographs of a young woman who shared Walter's eyes, his daughter Sarah, who had died decades ago. The resemblance to Melina was striking, and suddenly pieces began falling into place. Visiting Walter's old neighbors proved enlightening. Mrs. Henderson from next door remembered him well. He was the most generous soul, she said, showing Melina a stack of anonymous donation receipts she had found in her mailbox over the years. "I always knew they were from Walter, but he never wanted recognition." At the bank, the safety deposit box revealed more of Walter's careful planning. Meticulously organized documents showed regular cognitive assessments, all clear and detailed financial records. He had been preparing for this moment, protecting his decision. The alleged dementia diagnosis his family clung to came from a single doctor's visit, months before the will was signed. Further investigation revealed it was preliminary and inconclusive. Walter had sought second and third opinions, all documenting his sound mind. Margaret's accusations grew more desperate. She cornered Melina outside the cafe one evening. "You have no idea who he really was," she said. "You were just his waitress. We're his blood." Doubt crept in during quiet moments. Melina sat alone in the cafe after hours, surrounded by Walter's papers, questioning whether she was doing the right thing. But then she found something that strengthened her resolve, a photo of Walter with his war buddies, their faces young and determined. One of them, James Morrison, was still alive. James visited the cafe the next day, walking with a cane but standing proud. "Buck never did anything without a reason," he said, using Walter's old war nickname. "He was the smartest strategist in our unit. If he chose you, he had his reasons." Among the documents, Melina discovered Walter's secret project, detailed plans for turning the cafe into a haven for veterans. He had been watching, planning, seeing how she treated not just him, but everyone who walked through the door. The letters between Walter and Sarah revealed the father's deep love and grief. Sarah had been a nurse, known for her kindness to veterans. In one letter, Walter wrote, "You see people, truly see them, just like your mother did." Working late into the night, Melina organized the documents that would prove Walter's soundness of mind. Her lawyer called it a strong case, but the family seemed determined to fight. Another legal notice arrived threatening to freeze all assets. As Melina sorted through the last box of Walter's papers, an envelope slipped out, dated just 1 week before his death. On the front, in his distinctive handwriting, were the words, "For Melina, when they try to take it away." Among the letters, she found one written a week before Walter's death, specifically addressed for the moment she would be challenged. Melina stared at the letter's yellowed envelope, her heart pounding. The cafe's evening shadows stretched across the empty tables as she carefully broke the seal. Walter's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting filled the page. "Dear Melina, if you're reading this, they're trying to take it all away from you. I knew they would. Margaret and the others never understood why I chose to live simply, why I spent my mornings in a downtown cafe instead of their country clubs. But you understood without ever asking. Every morning for 12 years, you saw me. Not the decorated veteran, not the wealthy businessman, just an old man who needed his coffee extra hot and his newspaper ironed flat. You gave me dignity when others offered only pity. I watched you gather broken pieces of other people's lives and put them back together with nothing but kind words and fresh coffee. You remind me so much of Sarah, not just in looks, but in spirit. She too could see the war still fighting inside old soldiers like me. They'll tell you I was confused, that age had weakened my mind. But I've prepared for this. In the blue folder marked 2019, you'll find monthly cognitive assessments from 3 different specialists. Dr. Richardson at Veterans Affairs has my complete medical history and will testify to my soundness of mind. I'm leaving you more than money, Melina. I'm leaving you a mission. This cafe isn't just a business, it's a sanctuary. For 12 years, it was my harbor in a world that moved too fast, that forgot about old men with old wounds. Make it a place where others like me can find what I found. Peace, respect, and a decent cup of coffee. Don't let them intimidate you. You're stronger than you know. Sarah would have loved you like a sister. With gratitude and trust. Walter Buck Swords. Melina wiped tears from her cheeks, her resolve hardening. In the gathering darkness of the cafe, surrounded by Walter's papers, she began to understand that this inheritance wasn't just about money or property. It was about preserving a legacy of kindness, a mission she couldn't abandon. The letter slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor, landing next to another envelope she hadn't noticed before. This one was thicker, marked with a single word, proof. Melina's hands trembled as she held the envelope, her fingers tracing Walter's distinctive handwriting. The cafe's evening silence enveloped her as she sat at his usual corner table, the streetlights casting long shadows through the windows. She took a deep breath and carefully opened the letter. Dear Melina, Walter's words flowed across the page in neat, determined strokes. If you're reading this, then my family has begun to question my decision, just as I knew they would. What they don't understand is that family isn't always about blood. Tears welled in her eyes as she remembered their last meaningful conversation, just weeks before his disappearance. Walter had been unusually talkative that morning, sharing stories about his daughter Sarah, who had died young. You remind me of her, he had said, looking at Melina with unusual softness in his eyes. She had the same way of caring for people, even when they didn't deserve it. The letter continued, providing detailed information about his regular medical checkups with Dr. Thompson on 5th Street. Melina immediately recognized this as Walter's methodical military mind at work. He had left her a trail of breadcrumbs to follow. The next morning, she found herself in Dr. Thompson's waiting room, clutching the letter like a lifeline. Mr. Swords was one of my most lucid patients, Dr. Thompson explained, pulling out a thick file. We conducted regular cognitive assessments, standard procedure for veterans his age. He showed her the results of Walter's last examination, dated just 2 weeks before the will was signed. Perfect scores across the board. Back at the cafe, Melina began piecing together Walter's vision. Between the lunch and dinner rush, she researched veteran support programs on her laptop. The empty tables around her seemed to whisper possibilities. Walter's letter had mentioned how the cafe had been his sanctuary, a place where he could feel normal again after the war. What if it could be that for others? She reached out to local veteran groups, and soon found herself sitting with 3 of Walter's old war buddies. Their eyes lit up at the mention of his name. Buck was the best of us, one of them said, using Walter's old nickname, always looking out for the forgotten ones. The idea crystallized in Melina's mind, transforming the downtown cafe into a haven for veterans, a place where they could find the same comfort Walter had found. She sketched out preliminary plans, her notepad filling with ideas for military memorabilia displays, support group meeting spaces, and special discounts for service members. The next morning, she visited Walter's grave, the morning dew still clinging to the grass. I think I understand now, she whispered, placing fresh flowers beside his headstone. This was never just about the money or the cafe. You were building something bigger. She spent the afternoon organizing the medical documents, bank statements, and witness testimonies that proved Walter's mental competency. Each piece of evidence felt like a gift he had deliberately left behind, knowing she would need them. The lawyer nodded approvingly as Melina laid out her proposal, a foundation in Walter's name, supporting veterans while preserving the cafe as their gathering place. It's exactly the kind of thing he would have wanted. They worked late into the evening, drafting terms that would satisfy both legal requirements and honor Walter's wishes. Melina traced her fingers over the last lines of Walter's letter. Remember, kindness isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest force we have. You showed me that every morning for 12 years, even when I probably didn't deserve it. Now it's your turn to show others. She gathered the documents into a portfolio, including the proposal for the foundation. Her hand paused over a framed photo she planned to show the family. Walter on his last birthday, smiling genuinely as she brought him a slice of pie with a candle. The image captured everything she was fighting for: dignity, connection, and the simple power of caring. With the documents in hand and a peace proposal ready, Melina prepared herself for the confrontation that would change everything. Melina spent one final evening reviewing every detail of her proposal. The medical records were organized chronologically, each page telling the story of a man who, despite his age, maintained sharp mental clarity until the end. She carefully paperclipped Dr. Thompson's latest evaluation on top, the one that would be hardest for Walter's family to dispute. She laid out photos across her kitchen table: Walter with his war buddies, Walter at the cafe's Christmas party last year, and most importantly, the candid shots that showed his clear engagement with the world around him. Each image reinforced what she already knew, that his decision to leave her the cafe had been made with purpose and clarity. The foundation proposal was her masterpiece. She'd worked with a local veterans organization to structure it properly, ensuring that every detail aligned with both Walter's wishes and practical needs. The budget projections showed how the cafe could sustain itself while supporting veteran programs. She'd even included letters of support from other local businesses willing to participate. As midnight approached, Melina reached for the final piece, Walter's last letter. Reading it one more time, she found new strength in his words. He had trusted her with not just his legacy, but with the future of countless veterans who needed a place to belong. Morning came too quickly. Melina dressed carefully in her most professional outfit, the one she'd bought specifically for this meeting. The weight of the portfolio felt right in her hands as she walked to her car. Each step brought her closer to the moment that would determine whether Walter's vision would become reality or remain just a dream. She took one last look at herself in the rearview mirror, straightened her jacket, and whispered the words Walter had often repeated: "Stand your ground, kid. Some battles are worth fighting for." With the documents in hand and a peace proposal ready, Melina prepared herself for the confrontation that would change everything. Melina's heels clicked against the marble floor of the law office as she clutched her folder of documents. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, illuminating the tense faces of Walter's family members gathered around the conference table. Their attorney, Mr. Patterson, sat at one end, his expression unreadable. "Thank you all for coming," Melina began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know this situation has been difficult for everyone, but I have a proposal that I believe honors Walter's wishes while benefiting us all." She opened her folder and distributed copies of her proposal. The family members exchanged skeptical glances as they began to read. "A foundation?" Walter's niece, Barbara, scoffed. "This is just another attempt to legitimize your theft of our uncle's fortune." Before Melina could respond, the office door opened. 3 elderly men in military veterans' caps entered the room, led by James Cooper, Walter's closest friend from the war. "We're here to speak for Buck," James announced, using Walter's military nickname, since he can't speak for himself anymore. The family shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the veterans took positions behind Melina. James placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "I knew Buck for 60 years, James began, his voice thick with emotion. This young lady was the only person who treated him with real kindness in his final years, not out of obligation, not for money, but because that's who she is." Another veteran, Frank, stepped forward. "Buck talked about her all the time at our meetings. How she remembered how he liked his coffee, how she'd save the morning paper for him, how she'd listened to his stories when everyone else had stopped caring. The room fell silent as the veteran shared story after story about Walter's loneliness, his growing fondness for the downtown cafe, and how Melina's small acts of kindness had given his final years meaning. Melina pulled out the medical records next. These documents prove Walter was of sound mind when he made his decision. But this isn't about winning or losing a legal battle. It's about creating something meaningful from his legacy. She outlined her vision for the foundation, a support network for lonely veterans, with a cafe as its centerpiece, a place where they could find companionship, share stories, and feel the same warmth Walter had found there. Barbara's husband, Tom, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "This actually sounds like something Uncle Walter would have wanted." The tension in the room began to shift. Melina shared her research on veteran suicide rates, loneliness among elderly servicemen, and the impact of community spaces on mental health. "I'm not asking to keep everything," she explained. "I'm proposing we split the inheritance, with half going to the foundation and half to the family. We can all be part of Walter's legacy." Walter's youngest nephew, Michael, nodded slowly. Uncle Walter always said the cafe was the only place he felt at peace after Aunt Margaret died. The family's attorney consulted with them quietly, while Melina and the veterans waited. Finally, Barbara spoke, her voice softer than before. "We'll need to review the specific terms, but I think we can work with this." The next hour was spent discussing details, drafting preliminary agreements, and planning the foundation structure. Melina visited other veteran-focused cafes for inspiration, taking notes on what worked and what could be improved. As the downtown cafe began its early transformation, support arrived from unexpected quarters. Local businesses offered donations, volunteers stepped forward, and more veterans began dropping by to share their stories. The family gathered one evening to sign the preliminary agreement. Barbara, who had been the most vocal opponent, raised her glass in a toast. "To Uncle Walter," she said, meeting Melina's eyes, "and to new beginnings." Melina stayed late at the cafe that night, sorting through Walter's old photographs for the memorial wall. She found herself smiling at how things had turned out, until she noticed a strange envelope falling from between two photos. When everything seemed resolved, a discovery in Walter's old documents threatened to undo it all. The envelope was military grade, yellowed with age, and marked with official stamps from 1944. Melina's hands trembled as she carefully opened it, the paper crackling under her fingers. Inside, she found a set of classified documents, their top-secret stamps still bold despite the decades that had passed. Her heart sank as she began to read. The papers detailed a mission in occupied France that didn't match the official record she'd seen in Walter's service history. The implications were serious enough to potentially change everything they'd agreed upon that day. She quickly gathered the documents and locked them in the cafe's safe. Tomorrow would require another difficult conversation with the lawyer. But for now, the weight of this new secret pressed heavily on her shoulders. The foundation, the agreements, the family's newfound trust, all of it could crumble if these papers revealed something that transformed their understanding of who Walter truly was. Sitting in the dimness of the empty cafe, Melina stared at Walter's usual table, wondering what other secrets her old friend had carried with him all these years, and whether this discovery would destroy everything they'd worked so hard to build. "Please let me know if you'd like me to continue." The morning light was just beginning to streak through the cafe windows when Melina called Mr. Patterson. She couldn't sleep, knowing what lay in that safe, and the lawyer's grave tone when he answered suggested he understood the urgency in her voice. "Bring them to my office immediately," he instructed. "Don't make copies. Don't show anyone else." The drive to the law office felt eternal. Downtown was just waking up. Delivery trucks making their rounds, early commuters clutching coffee cups. Everything looked normal, yet Melina's world teetered on the edge of chaos. Mr. Patterson was waiting at his desk when she arrived, his usual composure slightly ruffled by the early hour. As he examined the documents, his frown deepened. "This complicates things," he said finally, looking up at Melina. "These papers suggest Walter was involved in a covert operation that was later officially denied by the military. If this gets out, it could affect the Foundation's legitimacy," Melina finished, "and the family's trust." She thought about the veterans who had stood behind her yesterday, about Barbara's toast to new beginnings, about all the plans they'd made. One envelope had the power to unravel it all. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as they sat in the office, weighing their options, the documents lying between them like a live grenade waiting to explode. Melina's hands trembled as she unfolded the weathered military documents she'd found tucked away in a hidden compartment of Walter's old desk. The yellowed papers, marked with top secret in faded red letters, contained information that made her blood run cold. She immediately called Marcus, her attorney. "I need to see you right away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about Walter's military service." In Marcus's office, Melina spread the documents across his mahogany desk. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" she asked, watching his expression darken as he read. "These records suggest Walter was involved in a classified operation that resulted in civilian casualties," Marcus said carefully. "But we need to understand the full context." Melina paced the office, her mind racing. The man who had shown such kindness, who had trusted her with his legacy, could he have been responsible for such things? The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on her chest. She spent the next few days tracking down James Cooper, another veteran who had served with Walter. When she finally found him in a retirement community across town, his reaction to Walter's name was immediate recognition. "Buck Swords," James said, his rheumy eyes brightening. "Haven't heard that name in years." When Melina mentioned the documents, his face grew serious. "Sit down, young lady. There's something you need to know about what happened in Dresden." James's account painted a different picture than the document suggested. Walter was carrying out orders, yes, but what those papers don't tell you is how he risked his own life to save a group of civilians trapped in a burning building. The operation went wrong, but Buck, he did what he could to minimize the casualties. The guilt aided him for years. Melina left James's home with a clearer understanding, but an even harder decision to make. The family needed to know, but revealing this information could damage Walter's reputation forever. She called an emergency meeting with Walter's relatives. In the conference room, surrounded by suspicious faces, Melina took a deep breath. "I found something about Walter's war service," she began, "and I believe you all have a right to know." She watched their expressions change as she explained, careful to include James's testimony about Walter's heroic actions. Walter's niece, Sarah, who had been the most vocal opponent of Melina's inheritance, spoke first. "Uncle Walter never talked about the war. Now we know why." Melina spent the next few days digging deeper into military archives, piecing together the full story. What emerged was a tale of impossible choices and profound courage. Walter hadn't just saved those civilians. He'd spent the rest of his life quietly supporting organizations that helped war-affected communities. Standing before Walter's old military photo, and what would soon be the cafe's memorial wall, Melina made her decision. She would honor both the man's heroism and his humanity, including the difficult choices he'd had to make. But the true story, she realized, wasn't about the operation that went wrong. It was about how Walter had spent decades trying to make things right. The secret donation receipts she'd found suddenly made sense. Each contribution to peace and humanitarian organizations had been his way of atoning. With the family's agreement, Melina prepared a special section in the memorial that would tell the whole story, the complicated human story of a man who had faced the worst of war and spent the rest of his life choosing kindness. "We'll include it all," she told the gathered family members. "The difficult parts and the redemption. That's what makes his story real, and that's what makes this cafe's mission even more important." The cafe's renovation continued, but now with a deeper purpose. It wouldn't just be a place for veterans to find community. It would be a place where the complex realities of war and the power of redemption could be acknowledged and honored. As Melina hung the last of the photographs on the memorial wall, she noticed an envelope sticking out from behind Walter's military portrait. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized his handwriting. On the eve of the cafe's grand opening, a final surprise awaited Melina in Walter's old house. Melina drove to Walter's house that evening, her mind still processing everything she'd learned. The small bungalow stood quiet in the gathering dusk, its weathered exterior holding one last secret. Using the key she'd inherited, she unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar musty air. In the study, where she'd found the military documents, something caught her eye. A loose floorboard under Walter's desk, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Kneeling down, Melina pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Walter's precise handwriting. The entries dated back to immediately after the war, documenting his struggle with what had happened in Dresden and his journey toward redemption. "The weight of command never leaves you," one entry read, "but each day we choose who we become. I choose to honor those lives by living mine in service to others." The final entry, dated just days before his death, brought tears to Melina's eyes. "In Melina, I see the kindness I've tried to cultivate all these years. She doesn't just serve coffee. She serves humanity, one small gesture at a time. Perhaps that's why I know she'll understand the full truth of my past. She'll know what to do with it." Clutching the journal to her chest, Melina sat in Walter's old armchair as night fell around her. She finally understood why he'd chosen her as his heir. It wasn't just about the cafe or the money. It was about entrusting his complete story to someone who would handle it with grace and understanding. Tomorrow she would add the journal to the memorial, letting Walter's own words tell the story of his journey from darkness to light. His legacy would be complete, not a sanitized version of a war hero, but the real story of a man who had learned the true meaning of service and kindness through his hardest moments. Melina's hands trembled as she held the sealed box she'd found in Walter's house. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of what remained of the downtown cafe, now filled with construction materials and the sound of hammers. She sat at what used to be Walter's regular table, now the only piece of furniture not covered in plastic sheets. The box was heavy, made of old wood with brass corners, and had "For Melina when the time is right" written in Walter's distinctive handwriting. Inside, she found a collection of war medals, photographs, and a leather-bound journal she hadn't seen before. As workers began arriving to continue the renovation, Melina carefully placed the box aside and walked through the space, supervising the arrival of new furniture. The old checkered floor was being replaced with warm hardwood, and the walls, stripped of their dated wallpaper, were being painted in deep blues and warm browns. Each change felt like a step closer to Walter's vision. A group of veterans, friends of Walter's she'd met during the legal battle, had volunteered to help with the decoration. They arrived mid-morning, carrying boxes of memorabilia and sharing stories as they worked. Tom, a Korean War veteran with kind eyes, carefully hung photographs of servicemen and women on the freshly painted walls. "Buck would have loved this," Tom said, stepping back to admire a black and white photograph of Walter's unit. "He always said this place needed more character." The memorial wall was Melina's favorite addition. Centered around a large photograph of Walter in his uniform, it would tell the story of not just one soldier, but of all who had found solace in this place. She watched as the veterans meticulously arranged medals, photographs, and service memorabilia, each piece adding to the story. The new staff arrived for their first training session in the afternoon. Melina had carefully selected each person, looking for the same quality that Walter had once seen in her genuine kindness. She gathered them around the only clear space in the room. "This isn't just about serving coffee," she explained, holding Walter's old coffee cup. "It's about creating a home for those who might not have one. Every person who walks through that door has a story, and our job is to make them feel heard. Later that day, the foundation board held their first meeting in the half-finished cafe. As Melina presented the operational plans, she couldn't help but smile at how Walter's family now sat alongside veteran support groups and community leaders, all united in their mission to support lonely veterans. When everyone had left, Melina finally returned to the box she'd found that morning. As the setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, she opened Walter's journal and found an envelope marked, "Read this when you've started changing the cafe." Inside was a letter, dated just weeks before his death. "Dear Melina, if you're reading this, you've already begun transforming the cafe. I knew you would. You see, I've watched you for years, turning a simple coffee shop into a sanctuary for a grumpy old soldier who didn't deserve your kindness. Now you'll do the same for others like me." The medals in this box aren't just decorations. They're reminders that behind every uniform is a person looking for connection. You understood that without ever wearing a uniform yourself. I've left you more than just money and a building. I've left you a mission. The changes you're making aren't just to the cafe. They're to people's lives. Every veteran who finds a home here will be part of both our legacies. Take care of them like you took care of me. Buck. Melina wiped tears from her eyes as she carefully folded the letter. The workers had finished for the day, leaving her alone in the transformed space. She walked to the front window, where the new sign was waiting to be installed. Sergeant Buck's Cafe, where everyone finds home. As she turned to leave, she caught her reflection in the window, superimposed over the sign. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw Walter sitting at his old table, nodding in approval. On the eve of the grand opening, a severe storm threatened to derail Melina's carefully laid plans. Thunder cracked overhead as Melina rushed to secure the outdoor furniture that had been delivered that afternoon. Rain pelted the new awning, its deep green fabric already proving its worth. Inside, the freshly installed lights flickered ominously. "We should check the electrical box," Tom suggested, appearing at her side with a flashlight. "Buck always said this building had temperamental wiring." The storm intensified as more veterans arrived, each carrying weather reports and concerns about tomorrow's opening. But instead of letting worry consume them, they formed an impromptu task force. Sarah, a Gulf War veteran, organized sandbags around the entrance. Mike, who'd served with Walter, checked every window seal. The basement began to show signs of flooding, threatening the new storage area where they'd kept the vintage military memorabilia waiting to be displayed. Without a word, a chain of volunteers formed, moving boxes to higher ground. Their military training showed in their efficiency and calm determination. Lightning illuminated the cafe in stark bursts, revealing the transformation they'd achieved. The walls, now adorned with carefully curated photographs and memorabilia, told a story of service and sacrifice. The new counter, built from reclaimed wood, gleamed under the emergency lights. Even half-lit, the space felt warm, inviting, exactly what Walter had envisioned. Melina found herself at Walter's old table, now marked with a small brass plaque. The storm raged outside, but inside, surrounded by people who'd become family through this journey, she felt an unexpected peace. The cafe wasn't just surviving the storm, it was proving its worth as a shelter, just as it was meant to do. As midnight approached, the storm began to ease. The veteran volunteers, soaked but satisfied, gathered around the counter, where Melina served coffee in the new mugs bearing the cafe's logo. They shared stories of other storms weathered, other challenges overcome. In their voices, Melina heard the same resilience that had drawn her to Walter all those years ago. Before leaving, Tom placed a weather-beaten medal on the counter. "Found this while we were moving things. It's my Bronze Star. Figure it belongs here now." Others nodded, understanding the gesture's significance. This wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was becoming a living museum of their shared experiences. Melina locked up alone, the sound of dripping water and settling were her only companions. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight had shown her that Walter's legacy was already working its magic. In crisis, the cafe had become exactly what it was meant to be, a haven for those who understood the value of standing together when storms hit. The rain continued its gentle rhythm as she made her final checks. Each drop on the new roof seemed to whisper approval of what they'd accomplished. Tomorrow would be more than just an opening. It would be a homecoming. The rain pounded mercilessly against the windows of Sergeant Buck's cafe as Melina unlocked the front door at 5 a.m. Despite the weather forecast warning of the worst storm in months, nothing would stop this day from happening. She flicked on the lights, illuminating the newly renovated space that bore little resemblance to the struggling downtown cafe of just a few months ago. The fresh paint on the walls still carried a faint scent, and the newly installed memorial wall, dedicated to Walter, gleamed under the soft lighting. Melina's heels clicked against the polished hardwood floors as she made her final preparations. Every table had been meticulously set with new linens, and the display cases waited to be filled with fresh pastries. By 6, her staff began arriving, their rain-soaked coats creating puddles by the door. "Weather's not looking good, boss," Marcus, her new head waiter, said while wiping his glasses. Melina just smiled, remembering how Walter used to say that rain was God's way of testing one's determination. The first crisis struck at 7, when the delivery truck with the ceremonial cake got stuck 2 blocks away due to flooding. Melina dispatched Marcus with an umbrella, and together they carried the massive box through the downpour, protecting it like it was made of gold. At 8, the first guests began arriving, mostly veterans who, true to military precision, wouldn't let a little rain stop them. They came in dress uniforms and civilian clothes, some with medals pinned to their chests, others leaning on canes or helped at the entrance, taking in the transformation with wide eyes. The storm intensified as 9 o'clock approached, the scheduled time for the official opening ceremony. Melina watched anxiously as the crowd grew, filling the cafe despite the weather. Walter's family arrived together, even his argumentative niece Sarah, who now wore a genuine smile as she admired the vintage photographs on the walls. Standing behind the podium, Melina's hands trembled as she unfolded her speech. The room fell silent, save for the drumming of rain on the roof. "3 months ago," she began, her voice catching slightly, "I was just a waitress who tried to be kind to a grumpy old veteran who liked his coffee extra strong." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. "Walter Buck Swords was more than a regular customer. He taught me that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives in ways we never expect. This cafe isn't just about serving coffee. It's about creating a home for those who served our country, a place where they can find the same warmth and acceptance that Walter found here." As she spoke, the rain began to ease, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, streaming through the windows and illuminating the memorial wall. Several veterans wiped their eyes discreetly as Melina concluded her speech. The ceremony continued with stories about Walter. His old war buddies shared tales that had the crowd alternating between laughter and tears. One elderly veteran who had served with Walter in Germany revealed how Walter had saved his entire unit through an act of courage that had never been officially recognized. The official ribbon cutting was performed jointly by Melina and Walter's oldest living relative, his 85-year-old cousin George. As the ribbon fell, the assembled crowd burst into applause, and someone started singing the Army anthem, which soon had everyone joining in. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Veterans gathered around tables, sharing stories and forging new friendships. The kitchen stayed busy, serving Walter's favorite dishes alongside new menu items named after various military units and battles. The surprise came late in the afternoon when a group of veterans presented Melina with a shadow box containing Walter's service medals, which they had helped restore and mount. "He'd want these here," said one old sergeant, his voice gruff with emotion. As evening approached, the crowds thinned, but the warmth in the cafe remained. Walter's family lingered, now fully embracing the vision Melina had created. Sarah even helped serve coffee during the busy periods, demonstrating how far they'd come from their initial hostility. The first day proved more successful than anyone could have imagined. The guest book was filled with messages of gratitude and promises to return. Local news cameras captured the events, ensuring that word of the cafe's mission would spread throughout the community. As the last customers left for the night, Melina stood in the center of the room, taking in the quiet aftermath of the momentous day. The rain had stopped completely, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air. She walked to Walter's old table, now marked with a small brass plaque, and ran her fingers along its smooth surface. While locking up the cafe that night, Melina realized her journey was only beginning. The thought struck her as she turned the final key in the lock. This was exactly how Walter would have wanted it. Looking through the window, she could still see the warm glow of the memorial wall lights illuminating his photograph. His slight smile, captured in that last Christmas photo she'd taken of him, seemed to hold a knowing glint. The street was quiet now, puddles reflecting the streetlights like mirrors. A few veterans who had stayed until closing were still visible at the end of the block, their laughter carrying back to her on the damp evening air. They had already made plans to return for breakfast tomorrow, eager to claim their own regular spots, just as Walter had done. Melina's phone buzzed with messages from the day, photos shared by guests, thank you notes, and even a few reservation requests for the coming week. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story, and 3 other veterans organizations had reached out about potential partnerships. She took one last look at the illuminated sign, Sergeant Buck's Cafe, before turning toward home. The brass letters gleamed in the streetlight, and for a moment she could almost hear Walter's gruff voice saying, "Well done, kid. Well done." The sound of her footsteps echoed off the wet pavement as she walked away, leaving behind a dream that had finally become reality. While locking up the cafe that night, Melina realized her journey was only beginning. The morning sun filtered through the newly installed windows of Sergeant Buck's Cafe as Melina turned the key in the lock. 3 months had passed since the grand opening, and the gentle aroma of fresh coffee already filled the air. She paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the renovated space that had become so much more than just a cafe. At 7:30, the first veterans began trickling in. Old Jim, a Korean War veteran, settled into his usual corner with his newspaper, while a group of younger vets from more recent conflicts gathered around the communal table. The sound of their laughter, mixed with the clinking of coffee cups, created a symphony that would have made Walter proud. The Foundation's first official meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Melina watched as the conference room, a new addition to the cafe, filled with board members, including 2 of Walter's family members who had become her strongest allies. They discussed expanding their support programs and the possibility of opening similar establishments in neighboring cities. As she served coffee to the board members, Melina caught sight of a local newspaper left on the counter. The headline read, "Sergeant Buck's Cafe, where coffee meets compassion, a local success story." The article detailed how the cafe had become a sanctuary for veterans, a place where they could find not just a hot meal, but understanding and companionship. Veterans from neighboring towns had begun making the journey to visit. Today, a group from 3 hours away sat at the bar, sharing stories with the regulars. Their eyes lit up as they took in the walls covered with military photographs, medals, and memories, a living museum of service and sacrifice. During a quiet moment, Melina found herself at Walter's old table. She had preserved it exactly as it was, though now a small brass plaque marked it as the Sergeant's Corner. Running her fingers over the smooth surface, she could almost hear his gruff voice ordering his extra strong coffee. The success of the cafe had led to discussions about expansion. During the afternoon lull, Melina met with her business advisor to review plans for a potential second location. The model was working. Combining a traditional cafe with a veteran support center had created something unique and necessary. The mail brought a stack of letters, each more touching than the last. "Your cafe gave me a reason to get up in the morning," one veteran wrote. "It's the first place I've felt at home since coming back," said another. Melina carefully added each letter to the growing collection she kept in Walter's old leather briefcase. Training new staff had become a regular part of Melina's routine. She emphasized that every customer deserved the same kindness she had shown Walter. Sometimes, she told a new waitress, all it takes is remembering how someone likes their coffee to make them feel seen. The daily victories were celebrated in small ways, a veteran finding employment through connections made at the cafe, two soldiers from different eras discovering they had served in the same location, a widow finding company of others who understood her loss. Walter's family had become regular visitors. His niece, once his most vocal opponent, now helped organize monthly events for veterans' families. The transformation in their relationship mirrored the cafe's own journey from controversy to community cornerstone. While updating the memorial wall, Melina discovered new photos of Walter that his family had found. Each image showed a different side of him: the young soldier, the loving father, the quiet hero who had chosen to spend his final years in a simple cafe where kindness was served daily. In quiet moments, Melina often found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. The cafe had become everything Walter had envisioned and more, a place where service members could find the understanding and acceptance they deserved. The future looked bright. Plans were underway for veteran support groups, job fairs, and partnerships with local military organizations. The cafe had become a model for how businesses could serve their communities in meaningful ways. As the day drew to a close, Melina sat at Walter's table one last time. The evening light cast long shadows across the floor, and the gentle murmur of conversations filled the air. A young veteran approached, hesitantly asking if he could join her. "Of course," she smiled, pulling out a chair. "That's exactly what this place is for." The cafe had become more than a business. It was a place where one ordinary person's kindness had created a home for those who, like Walter, just needed someone who cared. Looking at the young veteran sitting across from her, Melina saw a reflection of all the stories these walls had witnessed in just 3 months. His hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the coffee mug, the same way Walter's had in his final weeks. "I wasn't sure about coming in," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "But my therapist said this place, she said it might help." Melina nodded, remembering how Walter had once confided that the cafe was the only place where his war memories didn't feel so heavy. The young man's admission affirmed that Walter's vision had come to life in ways even he might not have imagined. The evening crowd had thinned, leaving only a few regulars scattered among the tables. The soft jazz playing in the background, Walter's favorite, created a peaceful atmosphere as darkness settled outside. A group of Vietnam veterans at the corner table shared quiet laughs over old photographs, while two Gulf War veterans discussed their transitions to civilian life at the counter. As closing time approached, Melina began her nightly ritual. She straightened the photographs on the memorial wall, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. The latest edition, a candid shot of Walter laughing with his daughter, had become her favorite. It captured the joy he kept hidden beneath his gruff exterior, the same joy she now saw daily in the cafe he had entrusted to her. The young veteran stayed until closing, helping stack chairs and wipe down tables despite Melina's protests. "I'd like to volunteer here sometimes," he said as she locked up. "This place, it feels like home." Standing in the doorway, Melina watched him walk away into the night. The neon sign of Sergeant Buck's Cafe cast a warm glow on the sidewalk, a beacon for those seeking more than just a cup of coffee. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new challenges, and new opportunities to honor Walter's legacy. The cafe had become more than a business. It was a place where one ordinary person's kindness had created a home for those who, like Walter, just needed someone who cared.